Hello, and it is my absolute pleasure to be welcoming you to our webinar celebrating the publication of this fantastic third edition of the Anthropology of Childhood by David Lancy, who is here today. And so let me just introduce myself before we start. My name is Camilla Morelli. I am a lecturer in social anthropology at the University of Bristol. And I've had the pleasure of knowing David for quite a while now. And so it is again my pleasure to be chairing this webinar, and I am sure that you all know David Lancy and his fantastic book. I'm sure that everybody in the audience has read The Anthropology of Childhood, and we are here to discuss the book today. And what the way that I would like to encourage you to engage is that I would really like you to submit your questions at any time during the webinar by clicking on the Q&A icon that you see on the black bar at the bottom of your screen. And so if you click on the Q&A icon, there is a little window that will pop up. So I will start by asking David a couple of my questions, but then I will be checking what questions you ask, and we will make sure that we cover as many of them as possible, all of them ideally. So thank you very much for joining again. And David, welcome. And thank you so much for being here.
It's a treat for me to have an audience, even if it is invisible at the moment.
Yes, it is an invisible audience that we are talking.
Live audience, as opposed to as a writer of a book, you have no idea who your audience is.
Yes, yes. So hopefully we will find out something about the audience later. But yes, so David, I would really like to start and discuss, first of all, by saying congratulations on this amazing, really, this is a wonderful third edition. The cover looks really beautiful as well. So congratulations on the book, which again, I have read it's really a book that has inspired my work so much. I really keep going back to it. So I was so excited to see that there's a new edition with new material. And this is a wonderful opportunity that we have to discuss. And I'm genuinely interested in finding out more about the story of this book, the ideas behind it. And I would really like to start actually by asking you, and I'm sure that the audience will be very interested in this as well. How did it all start? How did the idea for the book come into being?
Well, there were really two starting points. In 1996, I published this book, Playing on the Mother Ground, which I suspect people are more familiar with, actually, because it's been around a long time. But in that book, it was a straightforward ethnography of the Pella children in a remote village in Liberia, their work and their play, and the relationship between the two. What I did, however, was to ask a question which ethnographers don't often ask, or at least historically they haven't asked, which is, how typical is what I'm observing? What I was observing was so different from childhood in the United States, where I'm from, where I live. And so I was motivated to ask the question and to do a literature review on certain issues and questions across the ethnographic record. But that was rather cursory. And as time went on, there was more work accumulating, and I was aware of this. So I was aware at some level of a growing body of work. Second trigger, probably the key, was an article published in the American Anthropologist in 2002. And the title of it was, "Why Don't Anthropologists Like Children?" And went on to lambaste the field of anthropology for ignoring children. And I said, wait a minute, hold the phone. You just haven't been looking in the right places. And so that was really pushed me over the edge. and has been a source of motivation ever since. I feel very, how should I say, a little cocky, saying, "Oh, there's, take a look at it. You hold the book up for a second.
Mm-hmm.
This is a big book. There's a lot of stuff in there."
Absolutely.
Don't tell me the anthropologists aren't interested in children.
Absolutely. And
threw down the gauntlet.
Yes, it's curious that we still hear that sometimes.
Oh, yes. People are still, I had to chastise someone. I reviewed a lot of articles, for publications. And I had to chastise someone for using that phrase or that language and say, hey, you're out of date here.
Absolutely. So because you're talking about, how this idea came into being and how, messages you were thinking of sharing, could you tell us a bit more about this? So who was the audience that you had in mind when you wrote it? And so who was your intended audience, so to speak?
Well, you gave me your questions in advance, so I had a chance to kind of prepare. And so for this question, I use as a little prop the Swiss Army knife. And then I'll explain that. So when I originally conceived the book and began the process of seeking a publishing contract, I originally thought it was going to be a trade book along the lines of Sarah Hardy's book on motherhood. And in fact, it's quite parallel. But I didn't have enough clout as an author to get an agent, and you really need an agent if you're going to do a popular book. So I gave up on that idea and sought an academic publisher. So and Cambridge came to my rescue, so to speak, and we published it. It published as a scholarly book primarily. However, after the second edition was published in 2015, it was reviewed in the New York Times. So for a very brief period of time, it became a bestseller, and I was interviewed on talk shows and all this and that, as if it were a trade book, so-called, or a popular book. I still haven't found it on a bookstore shelf, but it has the character, at least, of because of the writing style, and it's full of surprising stuff for the average person. Because of that, it could reach a popular audience, but it's aimed mainly at a scholarly audience. But then it has a role to play also as a source, as an archival source. So if you just look, I think there's something like 120 in the new edition. There are about 120 pages in the bibliography, and there are 3 indices. So it's in many ways a reference book also, okay? But not surprisingly, since the book grew during through my classes. So I was teaching a class on the Anthropology of Childhood long before the book was finished. So the book evolved in response to my experiences with students. So Cambridge now frames it as a textbook. And I have taken, I'll talk about, another of your question is about changes, and we'll get to that, but with bearing students in mind, many of the changes in this edition are designed to make it more student friendly. Wow. So it's like a Swiss Army knife. It can be used for several different audiences and several different aims or purposes.
Yes, thank you, David. But of course, the book kind of keeps evolving and changing from an edition to another. And could you tell us a bit more about that? So how, particularly in this third edition, I'm sure that the audience would like to hear why did you change it as you did? Why did you feel that you had to add, that it was important to add the things that you did?
Well, first of all, I should say that just a little bit of a backstory on my modus operandi, so to speak. The book was published in 2008, but I'd been gathering material and writing at least 2 years before then. And it was actually completed in 2007. It took Cambridge a year to get it out. Sore spot. But basically, you have to go that far back. Well, from the moment that I finished the first edition, I continued to take notes and build annotated bibliographies. In other words, my method of research through the literature didn't stop. I kept gathering stuff, and that's continued to the present day. So there was never a break or a hiatus. I was gathering new material as it came along, as it was relevant, and storing it away in case. So I didn't know I would get asked to do a second edition, and I was glad I was. I had a lot of new material for that edition, but I just continued on. And so when the third edition was proposed, I have plenty of new material justifying a revision. And so that's just been kind of part of the background, that I've had these nets out there gathering flotsam and jetsam in the stream of life and keep hauling in good stuff. But some of my thoughts in doing the third edition were that I felt a sense of urgency in continuing to gather and catalog efforts to describe the lives of children and parents not yet infected by weird values and practices. It is urgent. In other words, there's a shrinking population in the world today who really are fit my book, if you will, or represent non-weird communities. They're becoming increasingly scarce. So I brought a sense of urgency to really search for recent studies in more remote areas.
Mm-hmm.
But also I felt some sense of urgency because the default research methodology being used today in anthropology is not ethnography. It's people are doing, even especially those interested in child psychology or child development, are using reductionist methods. And not that there's anything wrong with them, but it's not the job that I'm doing. They don't fit the product, if you will, that I'm trying to deliver here as a resource for scholars. I need ethnographic material because I want to show children in culture. I want to show how children adapt to their culture, and I want to show how the culture has sort of built a niche for child development. And if you're just doing very brief little snapshot type of lab research or little video snapshots, you can't get that information. So another thing I did really worked hard at was to go back and review the classic ethnographic literature on children and really bring the classics, mine them more thoroughly. So Jean Briggs's work, I felt very bad because I realized I had not given her star status sufficiently in the earlier editions. So she gets a lot more attention in this edition. So, you know, I went back and actually revisited Margaret Mead. And so it wasn't so much just finding new material, but actually going back and doing a better, more thorough job of reviewing some of the classic research. In spite of the decline in the use of ethnography and the decline of populations that aren't already starting to look pretty weird, there are new ethnographies coming out that are really good. And I wanted to call attention to Tiana Xiaoji's work on the Maasai and Maasai children and their enormous freedom and responsibility in exploring their own environment, the physical environment, with just children. And we expect that in hunter-gatherer populations, but not in pastoralist populations. So her work is in many ways a revelation. She's also very good at showing the relationships between younger and older peers and sisters, and how they help each other out. Some other changes, be a little more specific. So for example, in chapter 5, I talk a lot more about cultural transmission, which reviewers had sort of called me out on, said, well, you need to talk more about that. So I do. One of the dominant themes of each edition has been children's precocious involvement as helpers in ongoing work activity. I pay more attention to the delicate negotiations that occur in order to ensure that the child doesn't impede or undo the work of those more competent. So we kind of all know now that kids are just keen to help, pitch in, but how do they, how do family members guide and shape and how do they deal with that? Because in weird society, the way we deal with it is we just shoo the kids away and put them in front of a video screen and say, no, don't worry, I'll take care. I'll clean up that mess. Don't worry about it. I'll make your bed. What would you like for dinner? That's how we deal with helpers. We just direct them somewhere else. Well, of course, in the ethnographic the indigenous communities, they can't afford to shun the help of kids. I mean, the whole society depends on children contributing to domestic labor. So I wrestle with those kinds of questions. They're subtle. In chapter 7, I introduced a section on children learning crafts. And there's some exciting new work on children learning to make stone tools that I've added. Middle childhood gets a little more attention in chapter 8 as we learn more from an anthropological perspective. It's still kind of very sparse as far as the literature on middle childhood as a distinct period that is but with certain biological universals that culture plays off of. Structurally, this is back to the desire to make this book more suitable as a textbook or improve its suitability as a textbook. Big change is that I've taken my many lists of anecdotes, and I should say that's certainly a feature of the book. And I have to explain to people those anecdotes, listed anecdotes, that's my quantitative data. That's my, essentially, that's my p-values, the statement about the significance, statistical significance is typical in social science research. In anthropology, those of us who do ethnography, it's got to be anecdotes and convincing, vivid anecdotes, but they tend to clutter up the text, the flow of the narrative. So what I've done there is move them into what Cambridge calls text boxes. There are something like 58 text boxes separate. So each of these will have a list of 4, 5, 6, 7 anecdotes that illustrate the point I'm making in the main narrative. I think they're a lot easier to get at. I like the way the layout and design of the book, I had nothing to do with it. They did a good job. It just really looks good, it looks clean.
Yes.
The other aspect of the book, I'll just add one more feature that's been there since the first edition, but it deserves emphasizing since we're talking about it as a textbook. And that is that it's jargon-free, relatively jargon-free. So I don't use a lot of jargon particularly from the literature and psychology. I just think that kind of is a snare, a trap for a student. On the other hand, I make up terms like the chore curriculum that I think have some transparency and are not so off-putting. So those are some of the changes I call attention to.
Yes, so thank you, David, for this. I think it's you've explained really wonderfully how this what these new aspects will add, and I was also wondering. So in terms of changes, something that I would really like to ask you is not just what changed in this third edition, but what I would like to really know. And again, and I would like to encourage the audience to please write down your questions in the Q&A box. So if you go on the black bar at the bottom of the screen, you find those three dots, you click on them that says more, you click on them, you open the Q&A box, and please write down your questions in there, because I will be passing them on to David. But while we wait for the questions, I would like to ask you, David, not just about the changes in the book, but something that I'm really interested in is finding out, how do you think that your ideas in general, your theoretical view and framework on children and childhood and youth has been changing throughout the years? And also, what I would be really interested in, have you perhaps changed your mind about something?
Do I ever change my mind? Oh, that's an unfair question. You didn't prepare me for that, but okay. The latter part of it, anyway. Let's see.
And can I just add?
Go ahead. Sorry.
We just received a question that is actually linked to this, so maybe you want to answer both of them.
Yeah, okay, sure.
So Stefan is asking, over the course of your 3 editions, are there any big picture approaches or theories about childhood that you've thrown out in favor of new theories? For example, Stefan says, it seems that the sociology of childhood has made some strides in the last decades, but is still far from being interdisciplinary. So if perhaps, David, you want to tell us how your approach, how your,
there are multiple questions embedded there, but let me address one of them, which is, okay, what is anthropology, and I'm just a mouthpiece here, but what has anthropology contributed to a critique of existing child development theory? I think one of the most important ones, which I've contributed a piece to, most important ones is the, in effect, dismantling of attachment theory. And attachment theory is one of the most popular, well-entrenched, deeply entrenched theories in all of child psychology. And yet, there's evidence from anthropology makes the fundamentals of attachment theory almost impossible to sustain. And this starts, for example, with the fact that in most indigenous communities, you have alloparenting. It isn't just the mother with the child and toddler, with the infant, toddler, child, which is, of course, the assumption made by all the theorists of attachment theory is it's this two-person relationship, the mother and the child. So alloparenting. My own personal contribution to this, which I talk about in the book, is that when you look at cross-culturally at attitudes about attachment, maybe under a different name or just maybe that's people observing, when you look at it, it's easier to sustain a general theory of detachment. That is, there seem to be far more reasons for a mother to be somewhat detached from her infant and toddler. And I go into, what is the evidence for that? And so that's one. Another one I think that I'm increasingly enthusiastic about is trying to strike back, if you will, or to counter the idea that the reason childhood in humans is so long relative to other species is because they have so much to learn. There's so much, it takes them that long to become competent, to learn. Well, I think there's an enormous amount of evidence we can draw on that suggests it's not taking them all that long to master sufficient skills to subsist, to to live, to function in their societies. It's just that the attitude of the family is pretty laissez-faire. They don't rush the child. And so some children are more precocious and more eager as helpers, as hunters, as gatherers than others. But so that's I advanced the idea that children could serve as a reserve labor force. That is, kids, in other words, kids can do far more, they know far more, they're far more capable than they usually display. That's because they're playing. You look at them and they look like they're playing. And you have to look twice and thrice to see, well, the play is only a little baby step away from doing the same thing seriously, in earnest. So, for example, in your study of the Matses, the kids catch fish. They're amazingly gifted at catching fish, but they're not like adult fishers in the sense that they have to be sure to get enough fish to feed the family night after night after night. In other words, they run hot and cold. One day they're doing a lot of fishing, another day they're just playing. So we're misled, I think, if we don't really measure and look closely at what their skills, emerging skills are. So I think I have some questions now about the whole theories behind this elongated childhood. That to me would be another example of kind of a critique or opportunity to use anthropology to critique mainstream notions about childhood. So I think I could continue in that vein, but there are, whether we're having a very big impact, we meaning anthropologists who are studying children, whether we're having a really, really big impact on the field as a whole, I can't say. Heinrich's and his colleagues' article on the weirdest people in the world, they're identifying this weird phenomenon, has been a huge boon, I think, help to, I think I see in organizations like Society for Research in Child Development, which is huge, has thousands of members, and it has made real efforts in the last 5 years or so to become more interdisciplinary and to give anthropologists a seat at the table, so to speak. But, psychology is monolithic. There's 1 million psychologists for every 10 anthropologists, and we're outnumbered big time.
Yes, so thank you, David. And I would kind of like to go on a kind of unexpected direction now and ask a bit about a particular question, but it's just kind of what your answer just made me think of it. You obviously talk about children, which was your primary interest, working with children in non-weird societies. And, you just mentioned how they're raised in completely different ways. And you touched on one thing that really is I think it's one of the, because I also work with hunter-gatherer children in an Amazonian society. And one thing that has always really struck me is that how really children are, exactly like you were saying, so much more capable than how we give them credit for. And as soon as you go and work in a hunter-gatherer society, that just you immediately see how a 6-year-old can do things that
amazing.
It's amazing that, in the West, you really think, wow, we don't give enough credit to our kids and what they could do. So my question for you would be, once an anthropologist and an ethnographer knows that, how do you think, if at all, that kind of knowledge could be applied in a context, let's say, in the US or in the UK or in Europe, in terms of creating better opportunities, enhanced opportunities for children here?
Great question. I actually, so happens I'm working on a paper with 2 other colleagues, and we're going to submit it to Pediatrics Journal. My colleague Peter Gray, he published a best-selling book called Free to Learn. He's very interested in children's play, very interested in effect liberating our children from the constraints of modern weird society. And So the focus of the particular paper we're working on, and we're addressing it to pediatrics, is we're trying to counter the trend to restrict children, to overly protect them, to limit their opportunities to explore and learn about the environment. And my colleagues are going to be making arguments about possibly the handcuffing children or shackling them to a safe environment all the time may undermine the development of some very useful skills, resilience, ability to deal with loss, disappointment, failure, and that these restrictions that are imposed more and more and more in both school, well, in all environments in which children participate, these restrictions are a major cause of the spike in adolescent depression, suicide, and difficulties with college and so on. So my minor contribution to this has been to talk about from the ethnographic record, the enormous amount of freedom that children have to learn about their environment without instruction. And I would say one idea which I'm particularly hammering on, not so much in this article, but in the Cambridge book, but also in things I anticipate writing in the future, I'm really hammering on the idea that we need to look upon children learning their culture in the non-weird society as it's very important to distinguish between adult initiated and child initiated. So this to me is a very, very profound difference. In the village, it's not just that kids have a lot of freedom, but they take charge of their own education. They watch, they learn, and then they try. In other words, they take the initiative. They don't get kind of called over and said, well, we're going to teach you how to use traps for fishing, for example. Nobody ever says that. If they want to learn about traps as fishing, they watch someone make the trap, they watch someone set the trap, they take a discarded old trap and they play with it, they take it apart, dismantle it, and then they begin to make their own traps, okay, entirely on their own initiative. Whereas in weird culture today, it's just the opposite. We don't really let kids take much initiative. It's too risky. Look at how we've taken children's play and converted it into lessons. Parents don't just let kids play. They have to be educational experiences, educational toys, and educational activities. Videos for children tout their educational qualities, Sesame Street, and so on. So this is a point I want to hammer on, really push. So you look for openings, wedges. I say, overall, I don't think anthropology has much chance to influence the mainstream thinking about children's education and development. But there may be these where we have overwhelming evidence, like attachment theory, for example. There may be some wedge opportunities that we could take advantage of and bring about what we might think is more comfortable for both parents and children. I use the term benign neglect in addressing. I had a blog with Psychology Today some years ago. I haven't had time to deal with it, but the title of it is benign neglect. And the argument I made throughout that blog again and again was parents, American parents, Western parents need to practice a little greater neglect of their children. They need to look the other way. They're just, I'm struck by the statistic that even though we have fewer children, the birth rate is plummeted, especially in, say, Italy and European countries. Birth rate is plummeted, even though we have far fewer children. Mothers especially, fathers and mothers both actually, report much higher levels of involvement in childcare. How can that be? If there are fewer children, how does it doesn't compute? The arithmetic doesn't work. Until you realize what's happening is that modern parents are taking upon themselves all these responsibilities, which are really rather unnecessary in many ways. Responsibilities shaping, I mean, just taking over the child's initiative to do things and denying them opportunities to learn through being helpful, for example, through participation.
Thank you, David. I will. So again, I would like to encourage the audience to put their questions in the Q&A box, and we have 2 more, and I will have so many more questions about this, David, but let's see, let me get to the audience questions first. Sure. Wendy is saying, thank you, and this is all sounds wonderful. Thank you, Wendy. So Wendy's wondering whether you could speak, David, to the differences between this new book and your smaller book, Raising Children, which he has been using in a 200 level college class, and the students seem to respond well to it. But Wendy will also be intrigued with the possibility of using your big book. So what
maybe at a 300 level, Wendy. Interesting question. You'll notice that both books are published by Cambridge, and the Raising Children book was actually an idea that the Cambridge editor had, and he said, you know, this was after the Anthropology of Childhood had that brief period as a bestseller, which I mentioned. This was after the 2015 edition came out, and anyway, Andrew Winard said to me, how would you like to do a baby version of the Anthropology of Childhood that is a shorter, aimed more at a broad audience than at scholars or even students? And I said no. Initially, I didn't want to do that. And I told him straight out, I said, Cambridge doesn't market. This is a trade book. This is designed to be a popular, wide appeal book. And Cambridge doesn't do books like that. And he hemmed and hawed, you know, he basically said, oh, no, we'll market it, we'll do all that. And so I went and I realized that what I could do, I wouldn't have to write the book from scratch. I had my blog postings, about 2-3 years worth, and that I could take those as the basis for the chapters, because the blog posts were already written for a broad popular audience. So I mean, they were written in the right way, and they dealt with, for example, Wendy, I'm sure I'd be curious how students react to a chapter on what's in a name in the Raising Childhood book, because that's purely this sort of study of weird society. I mean, it's very much incorporates much more of weird culture, Raising Children does, than the Anthropology of Childhood. And that's one reason there are more places for somebody who doesn't know anthropology very well, more ways of kind of getting in to the field through that Raising Children. I think the main, whether or not to switch to from the shorter book to the longer one will really depend on where the students are going, how much anthropology they want to learn. I mean, are they majoring in anthropology? Is this 200 level class you spoke of? Is it a gateway class to further study in anthropology or child development, for example? And maybe the bigger book is more appropriate because it covers more of the topics and more of the issues that a student would need to have some command over. So it becomes more like an intro book to the field.
Thank you, David. Yes, this was a great answer. And we do have another question. Please, if you have questions, type them in the Q&A box. Mark is asking about the attachment theory that you mentioned. Could you expand more, David, on your statement about detachment, particularly from the classic mother-child relation?
Yes, okay. Well, let me say, Mark, back up just a tad and say that my methodology in preparing the book, but also in all my research, really is inductive. That is, which is not necessarily, it's like a natural historian. You go out and you record data and you bring it home and you try to make sense of it. What are the patterns? So it's, in other words, you don't go into the field with a hypothesis you're going to test. You go into the field with just a sincere effort to document as much as possible and then try to make sense of it. So when it came to the treatment of infants, I was drawing on multiple strands of literature, including the archaeology of child burial, for example. And there are a number of strands to this detachment theory. For example, high infant mortality. When infant mortality hovers around 40, 50%, it becomes really dysfunctional to develop a very strong attachment to the youngster who may not survive. So that's one reason why there's this degree of detachment. A second reason for the detachment, as I mentioned already, alloparenting. There are some societies where mother is not even the exclusive one to nurse the baby. Others pitch in to nurse the baby. Many, many societies where the baby is handed off even before weaning to be looked after most of the time. So that is, attachment theory can't really deal with what that means. Who's the baby attached to? If it's spent only 15% of its waking time with its mother and time with a grandmother, and so on. Another reason has to do with just the feeling of competition and rivalry, particularly in polygamous societies among multiple wives. There's a lot of cases of witchcraft, jealousy. There's a stream running through many, many societies which hides the child away, hides the mother and child. They go into seclusion at birth. They want to be protected from malevolent spirits, other women typically who are jealous of the baby. So in fact, there are societies where mothers refer to their children. Sometimes they dress a little boy up as a little girl and pass the child off as a girl, so that to prevent this jealousy from developing. So there's in many societies, there's this atmosphere where showing too much affection and too much attention to your infant could invite a kind of retribution or a kind of threat. So we can go on listing reasons like that. Many societies actually come out quite explicitly and have warn mother, chastise, the grandmother will chastise the mother. Then there's this famous Indian proverb, which I found in the book Rudyard Kipling's Kim, and which says that a mother is just for bearing the child. Only a grandmother can raise the child. So the idea that a mother's role is quite limited to the birth and the initial nursing, but that the child is really raised by others.
So it really seems to me that, first of all, actually, we need a clarification for a member of the audience who is asking, what do you mean by non-weird societies? It's a bit of a technical.
Oh, I don't know. There's some. This is a pain to try to define what we're talking about. But basically, if you look at weird society as modern, in post-industrial society, people we would think of as at least middle class, well-to-do, highly educated. The children are going to get a full education, high school, maybe in some cases college. So in other words, once you flesh out the weird group and get them settled, then it's kind of like, well, everybody else is sort of non-weird. My focus is really on children as described in small, face-to-face, remote communities with very little in the way of modern amenities, electricity, running water, not much schooling. I mean, most of the kids drop, either don't go to school at all or they've dropped out before they've finished maybe elementary school, where especially the mothers are not very well educated. So those are the places from which we get a glimpse of children who have not already been influenced by weird cultural values. But it's a tough question. It's really
Thank you, David. Yes, of course. I mean, these are all kind of terms that we make up. So Mary is asking a question about a New York Times bestseller. Have you read it, David? It's called Hunt, Gather, Parent.
Yes.
Okay, so Mary would like to know, how well do you think the author does in presenting some alternate views on raising kids?
Well, is this let me think, there's so many of these books on the market. Is this,
Mary, could you tell us?
Mary, do you remember who the author is? I think I know this book. I've heard of it, but as I said, is this the Michelin?
Yes, Doucleff.
Doucleff, yeah, Michelin Doucleff. Yes, yes, that's what I thought. And I've read it, and she and I have corresponded quite a bit. She's interviewed me a couple of times. I think she does a very, very good job. But the book's purpose, bear in mind that what makes her book powerful is not so much the anthropology she brings into it, because I would argue you could learn more from the Raising Childhood book we were talking about earlier. But she has it's the personal account of she and her daughter visiting these places. And so she has the benefit of looking at this through her own eyes and then through the impact on her daughter. And that, to me, so in other words, if you're asking me, is this good anthropology? Would I use this as a textbook? No, I would not. Is it good reading? Is it help us understand the relationship between the weird and the non-weird? Michelin has been convinced from her experiences that she thinks that the non-weird communities have a lot to teach us, and that we need to heed and pay more attention, as we've been discussing, that yes. Allow ourselves to be influenced and inspired by non-weird communities and the way they raise their children. If the audience has more questions, please, because we are kind of coming towards the end, getting towards the end, please write them down in the Q&A box. But I was wondering, because now we are talking about more general interest in childhood. David, I am really, really curious to ask you this. I don't think in our chats, I don't think we ever discussed this. I don't think I've ever actually asked, but how did you develop to start an interest in studying childhood and children? What were you interested in finding out? Okay, very checkered, very, very crooked path. I think from my earliest memories, I've been attracted to children. So that's a sort of starting point. I really, really, really enjoy children. I love watching them. I love talking to them, playing with them. The light of my life at the moment is my granddaughter, who will turn 3 next week. Started out that way. And then in college, I majored in psychology, and with an emphasis on child psychology. Then continued on to graduate school in experimental psychology. And, but had this sort of transformative experience when my supervisor in graduate school, my very first year in graduate school, got an NSF grant to do a study in Liberia, to do a comparative study actually in the US and Liberia, comparing children's performance on various tests of cognitive functioning. These were Western tests entirely. And the idea was to see, well, whether culture has an impact on these cognitive measures. So my job was a lowly job of administering the experiments, first in the United States. And then he asked me at one point, how would you like to go to our research site over in Liberia and supervise the work going on over there? And I said, sure. How do I have much time to pack my bag? How long do I have before I get on plane? So I was ready to go. I love travel. And so I get to West Africa and I'm dutifully doing the testing. Well, the test results were uniformly sort of uninteresting and didn't really reveal much other than, without at least 5-6 years of schooling, none of the kids that we tested did any good at all on the tests. I mean, that you could criticize the tests or just say that they've had a series of experiences that have not prepared them for this kind of testing. But meanwhile, I'm administering these tests or supervising the administration of the tests in the village settings. And I'm far more interested in and attracted to what the kids are doing outside the testing situation. So I was seduced because what they were doing just seemed so different. Well, in many ways, very similar, of course, running around, they're playing, but handling knives, for example, or freedom of travel, freedom of movement, helping out, taking care of their little siblings. I saw all this stuff I'd never seen before. Kids doing all these things I had never, ever seen or thought were possible. So when I was dodging the draft at the same time, didn't want to go to Vietnam. So I was in and out of grad school, teaching for a while, sort of just in limbo. Then I resumed graduate study, but I went to a different school and started a different program, which allowed me to, in effect, not cut loose my psychology, but add the anthropology. And so when I went back to Liberia a few years later to do my doctoral dissertation, it was primarily an ethnographic study. And it was designed to be comprehensive and describe as fully as possible the life of boys and girls in the village setting. Didn't have any school, no electricity, no running water, no road, no traffic, pretty isolated, so pretty authentic. Kids wore very little clothing. I mean, it was very traditional. Their subsistence practices, they were still can trace back hundreds of years. So it's a very traditional site.
Yes,
that's how it got.
And that, I think we can add there's one thing about also one other thing that links to a question that Alex from the audience is just asking, that usually in non-weird societies, you have children of different age groups hanging out together. And Alex is asking, what do you think, David, about the tendencies to educate kids all in age cohort groups in weird societies from age 1, as opposed to mixed age groups in non-weird societies? What do you think about this, David?
Good question. Thank you, Alex. From the ethnographic record, it's very, very clear that children learn far more from their peers than they do from their parents. I mean, the earlier comment about alloparenting, typically when the child moves away from its mother's breast, becomes a toddler, it's moving into the company of a mixed age group of kids, 1 or 2 of which have explicit responsibility to look after the child, but all of them sort of pitch in. All of them take upon the burden themselves. So there's this wonderful quote from a study of Marquesan children that children learn from their older siblings things like how to go to the bathroom. so etiquette, and they shape the kids up. So if you are of an evolutionary frame of mind, and you say we should be paying attention to practices which were probably around for a long, long time that are hardwired into our species. And I would say learning from peers is huge. And we have eliminated that from our children's lives kind of at our peril. I think it's damaging. So if I were asked to consult on this, I would say definitely in preschool. I mean, you definitely in the early grades, early grades. I think you definitely want mixed age, absolutely. And I realize there are logistics problems with that, but I think you can very convincingly and very quickly show the benefits.
Absolutely, yes, thanks, David. Do we have other questions? Please, if you have any questions, members of the audience, write them down, because we are getting near the end, and I would really like to see if you have any other questions. But David, I do have a kind of bit of a challenging question for you. And, selfishly, as an anthropologist of childhood myself, I would really like to hear what the answer is. Because what I would really like to know is, in the field of childhood studies has changed so much. And it's absolutely right. Even though we still hear that there isn't much about childhood and children, actually anthropologists have been interested in childhood for a very long time. You mentioned Margaret Mead before. So, and we have seen the field really evolving throughout the past century. I would like to ask, and one thing that, for example, has become quite predominant, I would say, prevalent approach is, for example, the child-centered, the turn, and all of that. So what I would like to know from you, David, is what do you think that the next big thing in the studies of childhood and youth is going to be? I know it's a huge where do you think, where do you see the field going? What do you think the next step will be?
Well, I think this isn't exactly the next step, but this is already there, and it's getting larger. So I would say that for reasons we've been discussing, the very traditional ethnographic study of children in non-weird societies, the kind of that really emphasize traditional culture that is enduring, that lasts for generation to generation. You have Bob Levine showed that very little, as long as the society remains fairly isolated, you don't expect a lot of change in children's experiences. So those opportunities to document that kind of childhood experience are shrinking rapidly. But on the other hand, opportunities to understand children undergoing change and adapting to the change are exploding. Because I've noticed that newly minted anthropologists, younger generation, the next generation of anthropologists, increasingly, in order to get funding for the research, in order to find publication outlets for the research, will have to study children in basically stressful settings, immigrants, refugees, warfare, drastic environmental change. Those phenomena loom very, very large. And I think you mentioned childhood studies. I think childhood studies brings in not just anthropology, not even primarily anthropology, but social work, sociology, child psychology. So these are people that are not going to be identified only as anthropologists. I mean, they're not going to be the Margaret Mead like. They're going to be more versatile in terms of working not just in academic fields, but with NGOs and aid agencies of various kinds, government agencies of various kinds. So that, I think we can see this. This is really going to become dominant.
Yes. So does it kind of connect to the point we were discussing earlier of perhaps creating creating opportunities for impact, so to speak, so for applying this knowledge.
Right. Yes.
So,
Yes, it's moving. You say it's moving into more of an applied perspective.
wonderful, David. One really tiny last question, because we mentioned Margaret Mead and you mentioned Jane Briggs, which obviously saying that you've given her star status, which is fantastic. Who are some other names that have inspired your work in the same way that you have inspired so much of my work, David? Who are your other stars?
Now Camilla, you sent me that question as part of the set of questions you sent me, and here's my response. I won't answer it because I'd use up all our time and still not finish the list. I mean, really, I thought about it. That was not my immediate reaction. I thought about it and I thought, this is impossible. It's just really, really impossible. And I'm seeking an analogy, and that is I really had to introduce myself here as the conductor only, the musicians, orchestra, the composer, the stage managers. I'm just conducting. I mean, I guess it may all come back in a way to Margaret Mead, just because she was. I think I appreciate Margaret. I had a class from Margaret Mead. It was one of my worst classes ever. She was a really awful teacher, but at the time I was an undergraduate, so I didn't know anything about anthropology, wasn't interested in anthropology. But since then I've come to really appreciate and what I like about her, she's a fighter, that she's just so assertive in her writing, and read the language, read between the lines, so to speak. And I just like her attitude. It's just feisty.
All right. Thank you, David. Thank you. So, David, thank you so much for this fantastic webinar, and the members of the audience are thanking you as well. Thank you, everybody, for joining us.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you. I appreciate so much having an audience, even if I can't see or hear them.
Yes, the invisible. Thank you to the invisible audience. But if you want to find out more about this amazing book that I absolutely recommend just for reading, but also I use it in all my classes, so it's really a wonderful book. So if you want to learn more, I am going to put in the chat the website. I hope that it's sent. So yes, so I just put I tried to put the website. I think Joanna will be putting it in as well. So cambridge.org/Lancy childhood. The recording of this webinar will also be made available by Cambridge. In the coming days, you can find it on the Cambridge University Press academic YouTube channel. And again, I absolutely recommend buying a copy of this book. It's really an amazing book, and it's absolutely a must read for anyone who is interested in childhood, the anthropology of children. I am really not just saying, I quote it in every single thing I write and use it in all my classes. So David, thank you again so much.
My pleasure. Thank you for organizing and leading this, and Joanna as well, who's not on camera but has set it up for us.
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you to everyone in the audience who joined us. And so check out the book at the website that we posted the link to, and watch the recording on the YouTube channel. And thank you so much.